Hi folks, this is Donald. For this week's sketch, you join me in Tokyo, Japan, and I've chosen this super cluttered scene. And the reason I chose this is because I wanted to practice a bit more on perspective. It's something I've been trying to get a vague grasp on, how to draw buildings and streets in proper perspective, and this one jumped out at me because of the narrowness of the building and the steeply angled lines at the top and bottom of the building. That seemed a perfect one to try out, and then it only dawned on me later on that I was going to have to draw all the wires and the posts and the street lamps and everything else, which I do enjoy doing, but oh my goodness, there's so much in this scene to draw. Where do you even begin? And my attempts at drawing it in perspective did not go entirely to plan. But I do think it's important to share the failures as well as the successes. That's all part of the learning curve, and I'm very much of the view that you can just embrace the mistakes as well as the successes and not get too downbeat when things don't go to plan in your drawing. The first stage of the drawing was relatively straightforward and probably the most successful part because I started with the central part of the building, and that's just a big rectangle with a rectangular door, a rectangular window and a triangle for the little bit over the door. And I think I'm finding as I get into more and more complicated sketches that there is a need for me to break it down into simple shapes and just take it one tiny step at a time, and that seems to be really helping me construct the scenes without getting overwhelmed by it all. Now, based on the feedback that I got from you last week, I have slowed down some of this to real time so that I can show you exactly what I was doing at the speed I was doing it at. And I chose to slow this section down especially because there's lots of things crossing over each other, and I want to show you how I would go about constructing sections like this where there's going to be wires crisscrossing each other and they're going in front of the large pole that they're attached to, and then you've got all the thousands and thousands of wires crisscrossing each other. I did edit the wires down a little bit. I've not drawn every single wire in the scene. I think I'd still be drawing now if I'd done all of that, so I just tried to do enough to give a flavour of what the scene was like. But you can see the speed I'm drawing at. It's very slow, very methodical, and lots of staring at the page, wondering what on earth I'm doing and where I should be going next. Always the hardest thing I find about drawing in this solid line style is that you have to try and figure out that you don't have lines crossing over other lines. And so if an object is in front of another object, I have to work out where that goes. And so I might draw part of an object like a wire, and then I will stop and I'll have to move on to something else like the rest of the pole, and then I have to go back in and draw the second half of the wire, and then you've got objects being added in that might appear to be in thin air, and then you've got to try and figure out where they would go and then hope it joins up. And in some respects I wish I could have just learnt to draw in a much simpler style that didn't involve all of this. I could have just done the scribbly scratchy way of drawing and it would be over in no time and I wouldn't have to think about all of this. But at the same time, I do love the fact that you have to work all of this out. Like I always say, it's like a big puzzle, and it is really satisfying when you do figure it out. And I hope seeing these sections of the drawing in real time is helpful in terms of getting your head around my process and the way I go about constructing these, because it's very slow, and the time-lapse element of YouTube videos does give the impression that this is really easy and it just flies by in no time. I know that some of you have even said in the comments that it absolutely flies by and you can't get your head around what it's actually like to draw this sort of scene in real time. I can't show you the entire scene in real time simply because of the time involved. This was a 4.5 hour drawing, but hopefully the little sections at least give some kind of insight into the slow and methodical process that I go through. And one of the main reasons that it does take me so long is that I spend a long time during the drawing just staring at the scene, and I keep looking back to check what it is that I'm drawing and to make sure I'm doing it right. And this is one of the things about perspective that I maybe do slightly differently to most people, is that I'm not thinking too much about the rules of perspective. I'm thinking about what is in the real world scene, because in effect the world's already worked out for you. You don't need to know the rules about 1 point, 2 point, 3 point perspective. The world has figured it out. All I'm trying to do is copy what the world is showing me. So you'll see when I draw the wood lines on the building that I'm really just trying to copy what is on the building. I'm not having to think too much about any rules. And I think just for my own personality, the way I try to do things is to try and eke out the fun of whatever the activity is that I'm doing. And for drawing, I don't really want to spend all my time thinking about following rules. I want it to be about trying to enjoy myself. And I feel like if I'm following rules, then that just takes it back to trying to learn stuff, because that's the way it's supposed to be done. And I just feel like I want to do it instinctively, even if it ends up being harder and takes me longer to work out. I just want to figure it out myself and do it my way. And maybe that's daft, I don't know. That's just me, that's just the way I am. So you can see there that I've been spending a bit more time letting the wires crisscross over each other and wrapping them up the pole, and eventually I got that section to a point where I thought that's probably enough, because any other wires that I need to add can be added in behind those ones. So I can move on with the rest of the scene and all the millions of wires that are on the right hand side of the street. Just like last week's drawing, this is exactly the sort of scene that I would have ran a mile from, just because of all the stuff that's going on everywhere. It's so difficult to get your head around when you start drawing that I'm going to have to draw all of that. How long is that going to take? Can I even do that? Absolutely no way is the answer I would have given when I started drawing, but I'm finding if I just break it down into little bits and pieces, break it down into sections, tackle one thing at a time, and then with enough practice, and I've got enough experience now at least, that I can sort of reasonably confidently draw any scene that I want to. I'm not saying I'll do it well, but I can give it a go, because I know I can get some kind of approximation of what the scene is like. And if you're a beginner looking at this thinking, there's no way I would be able to draw a scene like that, I guarantee you will be able to. It just might be that you're not able to do it yet. So now we're on to drawing the perspective lines that go down the right hand side of the building. So I've slowed this down into real time again to show you how I was drawing this, the speed I was drawing these lines at, and how I was figuring out. Now I didn't get this exactly 100% accurate, but I got a reasonable approximation of what the perspective is like on this building, simply by looking at the bottom of the building and seeing that the slats are kind of pointing up the way, or at least it appears that way. Obviously, if you were looking at it side on, they'd all be level, but from this angle, the bottom slats look like they're angled up the way, the slats in the middle look like they're relatively level, and then as you get more and more towards the top, they're more and more angling down the way. So I was just going along one line at a time, trying to figure out the angle that each line would go at. My line's got a little bit wobbly in the middle, but that's fine, especially because it's wood. I think you get away with it with wooden slats. They should have a slightly natural weave to them, if you like. Or that might just be my excuse for having an overly shaky hand. As I get closer to the top, I'm angling the line down the way, and then it gets more and more steep the further you go up. So that's my kind of basic interpretation of perspective in a scene like this, without using any technical mumbo jumbo. It's just my way of figuring out without getting too confused by jargon. And as you can see, I'm not absolutely racing through it. I'm not going at 100 miles an hour. It's quite slow, quite methodical. There were bits of perspective that I did draw later on that I thought didn't work, and I think it was largely because I got confused and also partly because I wasn't paying proper attention. I do think it's important to laugh at your mistakes. I do want to learn how to draw, but at the same time I don't want to take it too seriously or get too downbeat when I make mistakes. I feel like I'm making good progress in my drawing, and anything I don't really know how to do yet, I'm sure I will figure out eventually, and hopefully you can approach your sketches and drawings in the same way. Because personally I do find it a lot easier if I can approach a drawing almost with the acceptance that it's going to go wrong at some point, and you just get the disappointment out of the way before you even start. It's so much easier to deal with it when the inevitable happens and it all goes wrong. On the left-hand side pavement or sidewalk, depending on where you are in the world, I'm conscious of the fact that there are Americans watching this. So what we would call a pavement in the UK, you would call a sidewalk. I need to remember that sometimes because I would say things like a flat when it's an apartment. But anyway, my point is the perspective gets a little bit too steep here on this left-hand side. It is sort of right. It is in the right direction in terms of what it should be, but it's quite steeply angled. I mean, this is more like what a fisheye lens in a camera would do. It's kind of like you're looking at the street through a goldfish bowl. But that's okay, that's just part of the charm of hand drawing. I think that's my excuse for anything. If I draw anything incorrectly, I just say, well, that's the charm of hand drawing. But you know, that is my whole point about drawing. That's what I'm doing this for. I'm doing it for enjoyment. I'm not doing it to become an expert in art. I'm not doing it to become an architect. I am a fully grown adult who spent an evening drawing a picture. I mean, regardless of how the picture turns out, isn't that just the coolest thing that you could be doing that? Before I discovered urban sketching, I didn't know adults did that. I didn't know like normal people drew pictures for enjoyment. So actually just doing the activity is the success. How the picture turns out in the end is almost irrelevant. And that's something I have to tell myself, especially when I draw the likes of what I drew on the right-hand side, when it looks like it's going up a really steep hill when in fact it's a completely flat street. I don't know what I was thinking when I drew that line. That's often the sort of mistake that I make when I'm coming towards the end of a drawing and the drawing fatigue is starting to set in. If I had my time again, I would definitely not draw that right-hand side like that. It looks ridiculous and would have been better if I hadn't drawn that section at all. I should have just left it white. There was so much going on and I couldn't quite make out what was there. It was all becoming a bit unclear in the background. So I really should have just left it as white space and let the focus be on the main subject, which is the building in the middle, rather than having your eye drawn to the completely absurd perspective that's going on in the background. But hey, I learnt something from that, and when all else fails, think happy thoughts. I decided not to colour this one in. I felt like I had achieved what I wanted to get out of this drawing. But one last thing I did want to do is turn on a few of the lights. So I got my yellow marker, this is the Artist brush pen in cadmium yellow, and I went around turning on the lights to add a little bit of life and colour to the drawing. And I felt that was sufficient for this one. It's a long way from perfect, but the purpose of me doing these drawings is not to obtain perfection. I was trying to learn a bit more about perspective and how I would construct a super complicated scene like this. So I feel like I've achieved that, another baby step in the right direction. So thanks so much for watching, and for more sketchy goodness like this, you can click on this video right here, and I will see you in the next one.